The presentation will focus on the framework surrounding counter-proliferation financing. It will focus on an introduction to proliferation and proliferation financing, weapons of mass destruction, dual-use goods, the international framework surrounding proliferation financing, and the key differences between money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. What is proliferation? It is any process involved in the development and distribution of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons in contravention with national laws or, where applicable, international obligations. In the CIMA issued guidance notes, proliferation financing is defined as the act of providing funds or financial services which are used in whole or in part to make proliferation possible. PF may refer to any financial service provided in any support of any part of the procurement process. It can be facilitated through the financial system via transfers, mortgages, credit lines, insurance services, trust and corporate services, as well as company formation. Proliferators operate globally and exploit countries with weak export and financial controls. They master procurement as legitimate trade and purchase proliferation-sensitive goods in the open market. Proliferators normally favor the formal financial system, but may at times use informal means as well as cash. They use intermediaries, front companies, and trade brokers to disguise the true end use and end user of the procurement. Also described as weapons of terror, weapons of mass destruction refer to chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. There's a global consensus to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction in light of the continuous efforts of sanctioned persons or countries trying to acquire them. Proliferation of weapons of mass destruction prompted the implementation of international control regimes. The European Commission defines dual-use items as goods, software, and technology that can be used for both civilian and military applications. Because of the potential risk that these goods could be used for military purposes, regulators try to control or at least monitor when and where these goods are sold. The examples here are typical and more obvious dual-use goods. Are there any items that could go unnoticed as a dual-use good? The answer is yes. Let us identify other dual-use goods that we may come across. Titanium alloy, a dual-use good that is used for the production of medical instruments and aircraft parts. Gyroscope, another dual-use good that can be used for camera pivot stands as well as weapons mounts. Glycosidic acid, a non-dual-use good that is used to treat acne. Ammonia, definitely dual-use, as it's used in shampoo as well as mustard gas, which is a highly toxic chemical weapon. A flare gun, this one might be difficult to surmise. However, it's a non-dual-use good that is used for distress signals. White petroleum, a dual-use good that is used for nappy rash treatments for babies, as well as a gun lubricant. Due to the nature and dual purpose of these goods, they have been subjected to additional import and export controls. Resultantly, it is expected that financial service providers are vigilant in their scrutiny of customers whose businesses are involved in the production or distribution of dual-use goods. How does proliferation financing work? Let us first discuss the characteristics of proliferation financing procurement and financing networks. Every illicit transaction will require payment. Because the suppliers involved in proliferation are legitimate, the formal financial system is considered more favorable. Because proliferators operate using the formal financial system, their activities are at risk of being disrupted. Proliferators often seek to be anonymous in the global trade market. As a result of this, evasion techniques are usually employed. This diagram represents a basic procurement model favored by proliferation financing networks. Sanctioned countries or persons with ties to sanctioned countries typically work as intermediaries or set up offshore accounts to work with intermediaries to disguise the true source of funds utilized in a procurement process. These middle persons seek to gain access to legitimate suppliers and manufacturers, establishing a relationship and setting up delivery to other countries to evade the scrutiny of export control authorities and investigative agencies. Depending on the specifics of the procurement effort, there may be a need to develop the assets and infrastructure for the network. These include setting up warehouses, factories, safe houses, laboratories that may be used in the procurement process. These other countries can be exploited to host these fronts and provide a cover for further transshipment as well, following which the assets are delivered to the alleged buyer, whether an entity, front company, or individual, fulfilling the needs of the sanctioned state, and thus completing the process for proliferation financing. The United Nations Security Council and the Financial Action Task Force are the two primary international bodies that issue instructions and provide guidance on counter-proliferation measures. The UN Security Council comprises 15 members, 5 permanent members: China, France, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States, as well as 10 non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms by the General Assembly. The UN Security Council has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. It takes the lead in determining the existence of a threat to the peace or act of aggression. It imposes sanctions or even authorizes the use of force to maintain or restore international peace and security. According to Article 1 of the UN Charter, sanctions are measures not involving the use of armed force, including complete or partial interruption of economic relations. Targeted sanctions focus on certain individuals or groups in the target country, the aim of which is to minimize unintended impacts of sanctions on civilian population. With its power to impose sanctions on member states, the UN Security Council has passed anti-proliferation resolutions. Among these resolutions are the country-specific resolutions 1718 and 2231 relating to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or North Korea and Iran, respectively. Resolution 1540 is global in nature. Therefore, it is non-country specific. It seeks to prevent non-state actors from obtaining weapons of mass destruction and establishes binding obligations on member states. These resolutions are integrated into Cayman laws via the UK's Overseas Territories Orders and the Proliferation Financing Prohibition Law. The objectives of the FATF are to set standards and promote effective implementation of legal, regulatory, and operational measures for combating money laundering, terrorist financing, and other related threats to the integrity of the financial system. The FATF is therefore a policy-making body which works to generate the necessary political will to bring about national legislative and regulatory reforms in these areas. While the UN Security Council imposes binding resolutions on member states, the FATF recommendations are considered soft laws as they are non-binding guidance. However, the influence of the FATF can be noted in the recognition of its call for action and other monitored countries lists. Immediate outcome 1 of the FATF methodology requires that countries properly identify, assess, and understand their money laundering and terrorist financing risks, and coordinate domestically to put in place actions to mitigate these risks. This includes the involvement of competent authorities and other relevant authorities using a wide range of reliable information sources. using the assessments of risks as a basis for developing and prioritizing AML/CFT policies and activities, and communicating and implementing those policies and activities in a coordinated way across appropriate channels. The relevant competent authority also cooperates and coordinates policies and activities to combat the financing of proliferation. Over time, this results in the substantial mitigation of money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing risks. We will further discuss the coordination efforts of the Cayman Islands in Part 2 of the presentation. Recommendation 7 outlines the requirements to comply with the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. These resolutions require countries to freeze without delay the funds or assets of any person or entity designated by the UN. It also ensures that no funds or other assets are made available, whether directly or indirectly, to or for the benefit of any of these designated persons. A jurisdiction is effective under Immediate Outcome 11 when designated persons or entities are identified, deprived of resources, and prevented from raising, moving, and using funds or other assets for the financing of proliferation. When targeted financial sanctions are fully and properly implemented without delay, are monitored for compliance, and there's adequate cooperation and coordination between the relevant authorities to prevent sanctions from being evaded, and to develop and implement policies and activities to combat the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Now we will discuss the fundamental differences between money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. The chapter on counter-proliferation financing in the guidance notes also outlines these distinctions. You may use this for a reference. The characteristics of money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing may be separated into purpose, source of funds, transactions amounts, conduits, financial activities, and the detection focus. When comparing purpose, the aim of money laundering is to introduce illicit funds in the formal financial system to make it appear legitimate. Terrorist financing is used to support terrorist activities, while the ultimate goal of proliferation financing is to acquire weapons of mass destruction and/or dual-use goods. Typically, the funds from money laundering are generated from proceeds of criminal organizations or persons conducting illicit activities. For terrorist financing, the funds are generated from both legitimate and illegitimate sources, whether internally or externally from benefactors and fundraisers. The funds used for proliferation financing are usually from state-sponsored programs of countries that have been sanctioned. Money laundering transactions typically involve large amounts that are often structured to avoid reporting requirements. Terrorist financing transactions are usually small amounts that are significantly lower than the reporting thresholds, while transactions in proliferation financing typically carry moderate amounts to allow the transactions to appear legitimate. Each of these processes typically favors the formal financial system. However, terrorist financing may, from time to time, utilize cash couriers or informal financial systems such as hawala and currency exchange firms. Money laundering is usually associated with a complex web of transactions, often involving shell or front companies, bearer shares, and countries with lax financial services regulation. Persons involved in terrorist financing use various methods, including the formal financial banking system, informal value transfer system, smuggling of cash and valuables. Transactions in proliferation financing look like normal commercial activities structured to hide the origin of funding. The mechanisms for detection for these three processes are quite different. Money laundering focuses on suspicious transactions, normally deposits that are not in line with a customer's profile or expected activity. To detect terrorist financing, the focus shifts to suspicious relationships, such as wire transfers to seemingly unrelated parties. The detection of proliferation financing normally focuses on goods and materials, activities, countries, and individuals. Proliferation financing is linear, since the goal is to advance the ambitions of sanctioned states. The funds raised for proliferation financing are intended to be used to purchase goods and materials from brokers or manufacturers. Conversely, the money laundering process is circular, as the funds eventually ends up with the person or persons who generated it, as the aim of money launderers is to make their illegitimate funds appear legitimate. While the United Nations and several national governments have issued lists of designated persons and entities known to be associated with proliferation, sole reliance on screening against those lists may not always be effective, as they do not cover the full extent of proliferation networks and proliferation activities. Proliferators try to engage new persons or form new entities with different managers and directors to carry out transactions on their behalf. They also use several transshipment points before their goods reach the target destination. Proliferation financing tends to be directed by state actors who develop their own networks and distinct ways of accessing the financial system. Financial services providers should be aware that proliferation networks and methods will vary from country to country. Conversely, proliferation networks from the same country tend to behave quite similarly. Illicit proliferation can include procurement of illicit materials by sanctioned countries, as well as a sanctioned country that provides sensitive goods to other countries. These challenges, while faced by all key stakeholders, have the largest impact on financial service providers, as they are the last line of defense in disrupting proliferation networks. The guidance notes on counter-proliferation financing provide countermeasures to be implemented by FSPs, such as conducting risk assessments, developing internal control mechanisms to detect proliferation financing related transactions, and these will be discussed further in Part 2 of this training. The compliance program that a financial service provider may have in place for money laundering or terrorist financing may not have the same capabilities to detect proliferation financing risk areas and vice versa. While there are some similarities in the detection of money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing activities, the compliance program of an FSP must be tailored to effectively detect and prevent each of these activities to circumvent the FSP from being utilized to facilitate these activities. Money launderers and persons involved in terrorist financing may use similar measures. This diagram highlights the similarities in the techniques that may be utilized by persons involved in money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. For example, a money launderer and a proliferation finance network favor the utilization of front companies and hiding their beneficial owners. However, some unique occurrences with proliferation financing are the scrutiny of a customer's involvement with dual-use goods, or persons with a connection to a sanctioned country or a country that has ties to sanctioned countries. Please feel free to submit any questions that you may have to contactpolicy@cima.ky. Please note some additional references and reading materials for your use. Thank you for watching Part 1 of the Counter-Proliferation Financing presentation.